getting into our first segment of the day, we are going to be talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves pulling off this historic comeback in order to storm back and beat the Nuggets on their home court in this Game 7 matchup. The Wolves were down by 15 points at halftime, and things even got a little bit worse coming out in that third quarter, where the Nuggets were able to, again, we saw a real shift in how good the defenses were from the first half to the second half, where it seemed like the Nuggets had just fully figured out how to play against the Timberwolves. They were throwing absolutely everything at Anthony Edwards and really limiting them there, and then all of a sudden the script sort of just flipped on its head, and it was the Timberwolves taking over in the second half. And like I mentioned, this became the biggest comeback in Game 7 history in the NBA. And what was most surprising about this was the fact that the Timberwolves were able to do so without Anthony Edwards really having all that great of a game. He finished with 16 points, with 6 of 24 from the field, 2 of 10 from 3. This was, percentage-wise, plus the volume, the worst shooting performance of his young postseason career so far, for whatever that means. He had just 4 points at halftime, and then in the third quarters, really when he started to get himself going, he had some bigger shots down the stretch of this game, including the corner three with a couple minutes left that put the Timberwolves up by 10. But I do think that Anthony Edwards still was able to have an impact on this game, even outside of his scoring. We saw, similar to what we saw in the previous games here, the Denver Nuggets were just willing to entirely sell out their defense to stop Anthony Edwards and have the others hurt them. And for the majority of the first half, that was a very successful strategy because nobody else was really stepping up much for the Timberwolves. They scored just 38 points at halftime, and a lot of people, when they got to that halftime, were arguing that Rudy Gobert had the ball in his hands too much, which I can't say I fully disagree with. I think there was some unwarranted slander of Rudy Gobert during this game, which we'll get to later in this show here, but I thought that it was just a really good job of forcing the ball out of the hands of Anthony Edwards and into others. It was really interesting, I thought, sort of the way that Denver went about double teaming Anthony Edwards, where it seemed like they would send that extra body at him, and when he sort of froze and was looking around, they kept those two bodies there, as opposed to forcing him to pick up his dribble and then making sure that you get back in your rotation so that nobody's open. I think that this partially had to do, as much as we're going to be praising Anthony Edwards for this incredible postseason run, I think that that is one thing that teams can probably get away with now, while Edwards is still sort of developing into this go-to star in terms of his ability to process double teams as they come. So something I was just a little bit curious to see, whether or not we'll see that sort of patience on the defensive end from his opponents through the rest of this playoff run. But ultimately, his teammates just weren't converting in the first half, and I was at times hoping that Edwards would be a little bit more aggressive. Now, it's always sort of weird to balance making the right plays while also understanding, as a star player, you have to take over at certain times. And really, the most frustrated I was with Anthony Edwards was there were a couple opportunities in transition that he was just deferring. And again, I can't necessarily say that from a pure basketball standpoint it was the wrong decision, but he was just giving up these opportunities in transition when the half court was not going in his favor. He gave it up to Mike Conley after a steal of his own, who ended up getting blocked. That was right before half. And then there was another really sloppy possession in the second half as well, where in transition he gave it off to Rudy Gobert. And again, maybe it was the right pass in a, X's and O's situation, but understanding you are Anthony Edwards, you need to help ignite this team. Why are you deferring so much? So I definitely would not say Anthony Edwards was bad by any means. I think he is at this point of superstardom that we see, and we talked about this. It was during one of the games in that Phoenix series. It was game 2 or 3 where Edwards, his scoring wasn't necessarily there, but he is at a point where he's able to impact a game beyond just scoring points. And, that was really encouraging to see. Now, again, the unselfishness with him led to him being able to dish out 7 assists as well. I think that it worked out in this game, but at the same time, if things didn't play out for the Timberwolves in this, I think he would maybe be set up for a little bit more criticism, but we're not going to go down that path right now because this is a really exciting moment in the history of the Timberwolves franchise that hasn't necessarily had a lot of moments like this. There was a very funny post-game press conference moment between Anthony Edwards and Karl Anthony Towns. A reporter had asked them about what it was of them not losing in this big moment, the, cliche, I don't know if you want to call it a cliche, but the idea that young teams need to suffer big postseason losses before they're ready. And Karl Anthony Towns and Anthony Edwards were just joking, losing a big moment. We lost in the playoffs last year. How much do you want us to lose? We're the Timberwolves. We've lost for the past 20 years. So it was just very funny there. A super charismatic team that you just can't help but root for. And I think that it's really exciting that they are continuing on. It's kind of a shame that the Nuggets are out as early as they are, and I know that for a lot of people they have sort of fallen out of favor, but at the same time, the Nuggets are undoubtedly a top 3 team in the league. I still feel like they are closer to top 2, and Timberwolves end up winning this game, so you have to give them the benefit of the doubt, but I'm not going to retroactively knock the Nuggets. I still think they're great. We're going to get into their flaws later in this show, but as for Minnesota, in this game, the way that their defense was once again able to take it to that next level in the second half. We saw it with the third quarter. Like I mentioned, Nuggets came out to a hot start in that period, and it was really... Once Minnesota called a timeout, they were trying to challenge a Karl Anthony Towns foul. It was unsuccessful, so they ended up losing that battle, but at the same time, it gave them a second to breathe, and from there, it seemed like the Timberwolves were just taking over down the stretch of this game. In the first half, we saw the Nuggets doing a really tremendous job of getting on the offensive glass and dominating there. Jokic had 5 offensive rebounds in the first half himself, and then we saw the physical toll that it was taking on Jokic throughout this game. He played every minute except for one. Again, an idea that we will sort of get into later in this show, but like I mentioned, a lot of people were down on Gobert. I thought that he was still very impactful for them, being able to be that sort of roaming defender. And Draymond Green, as much as he would like to clown Rudy Gobert for not being the primary defender on Jokic in these games, it was Karl Anthony Towns who was actually doing the majority of the work there. Draymond knows better than that. He just has his own agenda to push. But in 2016, when Andre Iguodala came off of the bench to become the primary defender on LeBron James, it was the right decision because it allows Draymond Green to do more. He's not restricted to this one particular matchup, and I thought that was very similar for Gobert. And on the offensive side, like I mentioned, it seemed like the ball was in his hands maybe a little bit too much, but I thought that he did do a good job of being aggressive in moments from somebody we don't necessarily view as an offensive player like that, he was drawing a ton of fouls because he was, when he had a smaller man on him, going to be aggressive, and he was drawing these fouls. And because of that, we saw the Timberwolves sort of living in the bonus for what felt like the majority of this game. And I credit that to Gobert because he forced the Nuggets' hand in these instances, and he was actually able to convert on his free throw attempts as well, which is something that, again, could have gone sideways if he wasn't able to knock them down. But he finishes this game going 7 of 9 from the free throw line. So I thought Gobert was great in this. This was definitely sort of a testing point coming off of his 4th Defensive Player of the Year award. Him being able to sort of step up in this big moment And again, it's not like he was the primary defender on Jokic, but when you look at that defensive end, his presence was deterring Jokic from even trying the Karl-Anthony Towns post-up, because he knew if he beats one level, he has this all-world defender right behind him as well, and that's why we saw Jokic sort of floating around the three-point line far more than I'm sure he would have preferred to, but they were trying to run that two-man action between him and Jamal Murray, and Minnesota was just staying home in the paint. They had somebody pressed up against Murray in the mid-range, and then they did not respect Jokic from the outside. He missed his first 7 3-point attempts. He ended up 2 of 10 from the night, but from the three-point line on the night as a whole. But again, Minnesota's defense, there is a reason they've gotten as much praise as they have, and I think that Karl-Anthony Towns also does deserve a ton of credit in that conversation because, like I mentioned, when he is not fouling and actually is on the court, he is such an impactful player, and even just his size alone, period, does add to this identity of Minnesota where they are able to play so big and they can make an impact, sort of taking away the post from a lot of opposing teams' games, which was exactly how you had to stop the Denver Nuggets, and they were able to do so in an excellent way. So give us your thoughts on this series. Ultimately, I think that these were probably, again, 2 of the 3 best teams in the league. The Boston Celtics have a conversation somewhere in that as well. That being said, I don't think the Celtics would have been able to eliminate Nikola Jokic the way that the Timberwolves did. So as a Celtics fan, thank you, Minnesota, for doing that. But again, you have to give just so much credit to this Minnesota team. And something that we're going to sort of be expanding upon later in the show is the fact that the reigning champs are out once again, and this is now going to be the 6th straight year we have a new champion. We haven't had repeat champs. We haven't even seen a defending champion make the conference finals since the Kevin Durant Warriors in 2018. So it is really incredible to see sort of the way that Minnesota was able to handle the Nuggets. And now if you're looking big picture in the NBA, the level of parity is tremendous, which again, stick with us throughout the show and we will touch more on that. But for now, we are going to be taking our first break of the show. And when we come back, we're going to be diving into the Pacers-Knicks series. So stick with us and we will be right back.